Margaret Wilson glanced at her watch as she walked briskly down the hospital corridor. It was 5 in the afternoon, almost time to finish her shift. While stopping by the nurse's station to organize patient charts, she mentally planned dinner. She would make macaroni and cheese, her 8-year-old daughter Amy's favorite, on the way home. Amy had seemed a bit down lately. Margaret's days were always busy as the head nurse in the emergency department. Divorced for 3 years, she struggled daily to balance work and raising a child as a single mother. Her ex-husband James rarely visited their daughter since moving to the West Coast with his new partner. Though child support payments arrived regularly, James didn't seem to understand that money wasn't all Amy needed. "Margaret, you've done enough for today. You can go home now," her colleague Susan called out. Margaret smiled and nodded. "Thanks. I need to pick up Amy." "Where is she today?" "At your mother's." "No, at my grandmother's," Margaret replied. "Amy often visits her grandmother after school." Susan nodded understandingly. Margaret's family dynamics were somewhat known at work. She occasionally vented to colleagues about her complicated relationship with her mother Carol and sister Helen. As Margaret drove, her phone rang. The screen displayed "Mother." After a moment's hesitation, she pressed the answer button. "Hello, Margaret?" Her mother Carol's voice always carried a subtle critical tone. "I'm calling about Amy." Anxiety flashed through Margaret's chest. "What's wrong? Did something happen to Amy?" "She's been leaving books strewn all over Ruth's house again. I told her to clean up, but she won't listen." Margaret sighed. While relieved this wasn't an emergency, she was tired of her mother complaining about trivial matters as usual. "All right. I'll pick her up right away." After hanging up, Margaret counted mentally to regain her composure. Her mother Carol and sister Helen lived in an apartment in the same town since her father's death. Carol's attitude had grown increasingly cold since Robert died of a heart attack 10 years ago. She was particularly critical of Margaret, constantly complaining about everything from her parenting methods to career choices. In contrast, Margaret's grandmother Ruth was the only ally who consistently showed understanding toward her and Amy. Intellectually curious, kind, and wise, Ruth was Margaret's most reliable support whenever she faced life's difficulties. As she drove toward her grandmother's quiet residential neighborhood, Margaret confronted her complicated feelings. Ruth had considerable assets and her will primarily designated Margaret and Amy as beneficiaries. Carol and Helen knew this and were clearly dissatisfied. "Why are you the favored one?" Helen had once blurted out while drunk. "We care about Ruth too." In reality, however, neither Carol nor Helen had visited much until Margaret began bringing Amy to see Ruth several times a month. For Margaret, her relationship with her grandmother had nothing to do with money. Ruth was her emotional pillar and literally a grandma to Amy. Still, Margaret made efforts not to worsen her relationship with her mother and sister, partly to prove she wasn't spending time with Ruth for financial gain. When Margaret parked in front of her grandmother's house, she suddenly noticed her mother's car in the driveway. Since Ruth's health had deteriorated recently, Carol and Helen had started visiting frequently, claiming they were helping with caregiving. Margaret had mixed feelings. While grateful they were looking after her grandmother, she couldn't help doubting their true intentions. Opening the door, she heard Amy's voice from the living room. Her daughter sat on the floor, reading a picture book to grandmother Ruth, who was seated in a large armchair, listening to Amy's story with a peaceful expression. However, her complexion was noticeably worse than before, and she looked thin and frail. "Mom." Amy noticed Margaret, put down her book, and ran to her. "I was reading Alice in Wonderland to Grandma." Margaret hugged her daughter and replied, "That's lovely." She approached Ruth and kissed her cheek. "How are you feeling, Grandma?" Ruth smiled weakly. "I'm glad you came, Margaret." Carol and Helen emerged from the kitchen. "Well, you finally arrived," Carol's voice was laced with sarcasm. "We've been taking care of Ruth all this time. You're always too busy." Margaret didn't argue, just smiled. "Thank you for helping. I'm sorry I couldn't come earlier because of work." Helen, holding a coffee cup, said, "Amy was making such a racket today. You should discipline her better." Though Margaret felt angry inside at this comment, she didn't show it. "Mom, I'm hungry," Amy complained. "Yes, let's go home," Margaret said. "Grandma, we'll come back this weekend." Ruth nodded. "I'll be waiting for both of you." As Amy put on her shoes in the entryway, Margaret approached Carol in the kitchen. "How's Grandma's condition lately?" Carol shrugged. "The doctor says it's weakness due to aging. But don't worry, we're taking good care of her." Margaret nodded, feeling anxious. "Let me know if anything happens." Getting into the car, Margaret checked Amy's expression in the rearview mirror. Her normally chatty daughter was strangely quiet today. "What's wrong, Amy? Are you okay?" Amy nodded slightly, staring out the window. "I'm fine." However, Margaret sensed her daughter was hiding something. "Did something happen at Grandma's house?" "No, nothing," Amy answered, but her eyes never met her mother's. Several weeks passed, and Margaret noticed clear changes in Amy's behavior. Her usually energetic daughter, who would excitedly tell stories about her adventures and friends after school, had become withdrawn. She seemed especially exhausted after returning from her grandmother's house and had more frequent nightmares. One night, Margaret was awakened by Amy's screams and rushed to her daughter's room. Amy was curled up on her bed, trembling. "Amy, are you all right?" Margaret gently embraced her daughter. "Did you have a bad dream?" Amy nodded in her mother's arms, cold sweat seeping from her small body. "What was the dream about? Can you tell me?" After a long silence, Amy finally said in a small voice, "Grandma looked like she was suffering." While wiping the sweat from Amy's forehead, Margaret gently prompted, "And?" "Mom, Grandma's been acting strange lately," Amy said with a face that looked ready to cry. "She's always sleepy and doesn't listen to me anymore." "I see." Margaret stroked her daughter's head thoughtfully. Could Ruth be showing early symptoms of dementia? Or was she simply feeling unwell? "Should we visit Grandma tomorrow?" Margaret suggested. Amy didn't answer immediately, looking up at her mother anxiously. "I don't want to go when Aunt Helen and Grandma Carol are there." Margaret was surprised by these words. Amy had never shown clear aversion to her mother and sister before. "Why? Did something happen?" Amy fell silent again, murmuring, "Nothing." The next day, during her lunch break at the hospital, Margaret was eating in the cafeteria with her colleague Janet, who was also a longtime friend of Carol's. "Oh, Margaret. I saw your mother and Helen last week," Janet said casually. "They seem to be consulting a lawyer about managing Ruth's assets." Margaret couldn't hide her surprise. Managing her assets? Is Grandma too ill to manage them herself? Janet smiled awkwardly. "I'm sorry, you didn't know." Since Carol mentioned Ruth's condition was deteriorating, I assumed. Throughout her afternoon shift, Margaret felt uneasy about her mother and sister's actions. After work, she stopped by the bank to check the history of the joint account she shared with Ruth. Ruth had added Margaret as a joint account holder years ago in case of emergencies. Looking at the transaction history, Margaret gasped. Several large sums had been withdrawn over the past month, totaling about $30,000. This clearly deviated from the normal pattern. That evening, Margaret called her mother. "Mom, large amounts have been withdrawn from Ruth's account. What was it used for?" After a moment of silence, Carol calmly replied, "For Ruth's care expenses. We hired an in-home caregiver. And medications are expensive too." "What in-home caregiver?" "I've never met them. They just don't come during the hours when you visit," Carol said with undisguised irritation. "Since we're taking care of Ruth, you can leave the details to us." Unsatisfied, Margaret hung up and promptly made an appointment with attorney Cheryl Cohen for the following day. Cheryl was also the lawyer who had prepared Ruth's will. "I'm concerned about Ruth's recent condition," Cheryl said with a serious expression after hearing Margaret's explanation. "I recommend getting a cognitive assessment. If there are issues with her judgment capacity, we might need to consider legal measures for asset management." "My mother and Helen seem to be already taking action," Margaret said, not hiding her anxiety. "That's concerning," Cheryl frowned. "I'll contact Ruth myself." I need to meet her in person to assess the situation. That evening, Margaret picked up Amy from school. Shall we go to Grandma's house today? She suggested, but Amy looked anxious. Grandma might not recognize me even if I go. What do you mean? Margaret felt alarmed by her daughter's words. Grandma's been sleeping a lot lately, Amy said, kicking the ground with her toe. Grandma Carol and Aunt Helen give her medicine. After she takes it, Grandma falls asleep right away. Margaret's heart raced. Did you see what kind of medicine it was? Amy shook her head. Small white pills. But they won't show me. Margaret took a deep breath to regain her composure. Amy, has anything else changed at Grandma's house recently? Amy thought quietly, then answered in a small voice, strangers come. Men in suits. They were getting signatures on papers. This information heightened Margaret's anxiety to its peak. Was someone having Ruth sign documents? While she was under medication and not fully conscious. Amy, let's go see Grandma today. But this will be our little secret, Margaret resolved. If Mom or Aunt Helen are there, act normal. Don't say anything. Amy nodded with a serious expression. On the way to Ruth's house, Margaret's phone rang. The screen showed Cheryl Cohen. Margaret, I can't reach Ruth. Cheryl's voice was clearly worried. She always answers the phone, but... I'm on my way to Grandma's house now, Margaret replied. I'll let you know if I find anything. When they arrived at Ruth's house, her mother's car wasn't there. Sighing with relief, Margaret pressed the intercom. No answer. Taking out her key, she opened the door to find the house completely silent. Grandma? Amy called out in a small voice. They entered the living room. Ruth was sitting in her usual armchair, but her appearance froze Margaret's heart. The elderly woman was staring out the window with vacant eyes, looking even thinner and smaller than before. Grandma? Margaret rushed over and took Ruth's hand. It's me, Margaret. Ruth slowly turned her face, showing momentary confusion before faintly smiling. Garrett. Her voice was weak, as if coming from far away. From her nursing experience, Margaret intuitively understood this wasn't simply aging or fatigue. Ruth was under the influence of some medication. Grandma, what happened? When Margaret asked, Ruth blinked in confusion. I don't know. Ruth slowly formed her words. Carol gives me medicine for the pain, she says. Margaret gently touched Ruth's cheek. Are you in pain? Where? Ruth shook her head. Not in pain, but sleepy, always sleepy. Just then, they heard the front door opening. Carol and Helen had returned. Margaret quickly kissed Ruth's forehead and whispered, I'll come back later. Nurse Wilson, phone call for you. Head nurse Alex's voice brought Margaret's thoughts back to reality. They say it's urgent. Margaret rushed to the nurse's station. Taking the receiver, she heard her mother Carol's calm voice. Margaret, come to Ruth's house immediately. Amy has collapsed. She's unconscious. With her heart pounding and hands shaking, Margaret dashed out of the hospital. My 8-year-old daughter collapsed, and my mother called to tell me to come to my grandmother's house right away. Her mind focused solely on this fact, everything else became a blur. Pulling up in front of her grandmother's house, Margaret jumped out before even turning off the engine and ran to the entrance. Her hand trembled as she inserted the key. After several failed attempts, the door finally opened. An unusual silence dominated the entire house as she entered. Amy. Margaret called out. Amy, where are you? Over here, in the living room, her mother Carol's voice replied. There was a calmness in her voice that seemed oddly disconnected from the emergency of having an unconscious child. Margaret rushed into the living room. The scene she witnessed there would be etched in her memory forever. Her mother Carol and sister Helen sat on the sofa, chatting while drinking tea. Their casual, everyday demeanor was completely at odds with this emergency. And on a small daybed next to the sofa lay Amy, eyes closed, face pale, looking as if she were sleeping. Amy. Margaret ran to her daughter. She didn't miss the glance exchanged between Carol and Helen. There was anxiety in their expressions, and the look of people hiding something. What happened? What's going on? Margaret demanded, taking Amy's hand. My, you're being dramatic, Carol said. She's just tired and sleeping. That's right, Helen agreed. It's nothing unusual. Margaret checked Amy's pulse and breathing. Her pulse was weak, her breathing shallow. My mother and sister laughed and said, "See, she's weak in body and mind, just as we thought." Margaret placed her hand on her daughter's forehead as she heard their words. There was no fever. But this was clearly not a normal sleep state. This isn't normal, Margaret raised her voice. What happened? Why did Amy collapse? Carol and Helen exchanged troubled looks. There was a hint of panic in their expressions. They exchanged glances and seemed to communicate something with their eyes before Carol spoke. Oh, it's nothing unusual. Being your child, of course she's weak in body and mind. Margaret felt intense anger at these words. After the divorce, her mother had often criticized Amy's sensitive nature and Margaret's parenting methods. But now wasn't the time for such arguments. When I asked why she collapsed, my mother just laughed lightly and said, "She just fell asleep before we knew it." What do you mean? Margaret narrowed her eyes at her mother. You said on the phone, Amy has collapsed. She's unconscious. Oh, did I say that? Perhaps I was a bit dramatic, Carol shrugged. Amy was reading to Ruth and then she got sleepy. We found her asleep. Based on her nursing training, Margaret checked Amy's condition again. She lightly tapped her daughter's cheek and called, "Amy, can you hear me? Open your eyes." There was no response. This is not normal sleep, Margaret declared. We need to call an ambulance. You're overreacting. Helen interrupted. She's just tired and sleeping. She'll wake up soon. Margaret continued examining Amy's body. There were no injection marks on her arms, no head injuries. But she noticed that Amy's right hand was tightly clenched. Where's Ruth? Margaret suddenly remembered her grandmother and asked. Resting in her room, Carol quickly answered. She hasn't been feeling well since this morning. But I'm calling an ambulance, Margaret took out her cell phone. This is clearly not normal sleep. Stop it. Carol stood up and grabbed Margaret's hand. Don't cause unnecessary worry by making a big deal out of this. Let go of me. Margaret shook off her mother's hand. At that moment, Helen stepped between them. Calm down. Amy is really fine. Let's wait a little longer and see. Margaret decided to trust her instincts. But first, she needed to examine her daughter's condition more closely. Looking at Amy's hand again, she noticed the small fist was rigid, clenching something. But I noticed my daughter's small hand. Margaret carefully began to spread Amy's tightly clenched fingers. What are you holding? It's nothing, Helen said hastily. Children often hold things while they sleep. Ignoring her, Margaret gently opened Amy's fingers one by one. There was a small pill, carefully wrapped in tape. Noticing something attached to the back, Margaret turned it over. And the moment I saw what she was holding, I didn't hesitate to call the police. Carefully attached to the back of the taped pill was a piece of a prescription label. It had Ruth Wilson printed on it along with Ambien 10 milligrams. A powerful sleeping pill. What is this? Margaret showed the pill to her mother and sister. Why does Amy have this? The color drained from both their faces. Helen stammered, while Carol suddenly became aggressive. I don't know what you're talking about. Amy must have picked it up somewhere. Margaret organized the situation in her mind. Her daughter lay unconscious, clutching a powerful sleeping pill prescribed to her grandmother. Recently, her grandmother had always seemed drowsy. Her mother and sister were clearly hiding something. What did you do to Amy? Margaret's voice trembled. Did you give her this medicine? Don't talk nonsense. Carol raised her voice. We would never do such a thing. Margaret checked her daughter's pulse again. It was weak but stable. She slowly picked up her purse from the table and casually took out her cell phone. "Amy seems okay," she said, feigning calmness. "I'm going to use the bathroom for a moment." Once locked in the bathroom, Margaret immediately called the police. In a low voice, she explained the situation and requested an ambulance and police officers. "My 8-year-old daughter is unconscious and holding a prescribed sleeping pill. My grandmother may also be being drugged." After the call, Margaret took a deep breath to calm herself. Then she returned to the living room and sat beside Amy. Carol and Helen looked clearly anxious, frequently exchanging glances. "Amy holding this pill wasn't a coincidence, was it?" Margaret said quietly. "She was trying to tell me something." "What are you talking about?" Carol's voice shook. "It was just a coincidence." Margaret looked at her mother and announced, "The truth will come out soon. I've called an ambulance." "What?" Helen exclaimed. "Why? We told you she's fine." "I'm not going to risk my daughter's life," Margaret said firmly. "And the police are coming too." The remaining color drained from Carol and Helen's faces. They fell silent and huddled at the end of the sofa, distancing themselves from Margaret and Amy. Margaret gently stroked Amy's small cheek and whispered, "It's okay, Mom will protect you." Then she looked coldly at Carol and Helen. "I won't let you near Ruth or Amy ever again." Soon the doorbell rang, and 2 uniformed police officers and paramedics stood at the entrance. Margaret invited them in. "This way," she led the paramedics to Amy. "This is my daughter Amy. She's unconscious, with a weak pulse and shallow breathing." Regaining her composure as a nurse, Margaret explained the situation to the paramedics. "I suspect an overdose of sleeping pills. She was holding this." She handed over the taped pill in an evidence bag. One of the officers, Officer Johnson, approached her mother and sister. "I have some questions for both of you. Could we talk in separate rooms?" Though Carol and Helen resisted, the other officer, Officer Morris, remained in the living room watching them while Officer Johnson took Carol to the kitchen. "Where's Ruth?" Margaret asked Officer Morris as she watched the paramedics transfer Amy to a stretcher. "Your grandmother?" "I'll check." Officer Morris went upstairs and began checking each room on the second floor. A few minutes later, a voice called from upstairs, "We need paramedics. There's another patient here." Though anxious, Margaret decided to accompany Amy first. "I'm going to the hospital with my daughter. Please take care of my grandmother." Before boarding the ambulance, Margaret approached Officer Johnson and whispered, "They were after my grandmother's assets. My mother and sister were drugging her into a stupor and having her sign documents. Amy probably saw something." Officer Johnson nodded with a stern expression. "We'll investigate. I'll speak with you again at the hospital." In the ambulance, Margaret held Amy's small hand tightly. With her heart racing, she gazed at her daughter's face almost prayerfully. "It's okay, Amy. Mom's here with you." Upon arrival at the hospital, Amy was immediately taken to a treatment room. Preparations for gastric lavage began, and blood was drawn for testing. Margaret found herself surrounded by colleagues, speechless at the gravity of the situation. "Sleeping pill overdose," Dr. Linden, the attending physician, said while looking at the blood test results. "It's a significant amount, but fortunately it was discovered early. If it had been a little later, she might have experienced respiratory depression." Margaret placed her hand on her chest and exhaled deeply. "She'll be okay?" "Yes, absolutely," Dr. Linden smiled reassuringly. "She should regain consciousness in a few hours. She'll likely be discharged tomorrow." Time passed, and night fell. Margaret continued her vigil at Amy's bedside. Around 11 p.m., Amy finally opened her eyes. "Mom." Amy called in a small voice. "Amy." Margaret stood up and gently embraced her daughter. "Are you okay? Does anything hurt?" Amy looked around, somewhat confused. "Is this the hospital?" "Yes," Margaret answered, gently stroking her daughter's hair. "You slept a little too much. Amy's expression froze, and fear appeared on her face. Grandma Carol and Aunt Helen. It's okay, now, Margaret assured her. They can't come near you anymore. The police will protect you. These words seemed to reassure Amy somewhat, though her anxious expression didn't completely disappear. Margaret gently asked, Amy, what happened? Can you tell me? Amy bit her trembling lip and slowly began to speak. Grandma was acting strange. Always sleepy. Since when? Margaret gently prompted. A few weeks ago. Amy was trying hard to remember. Grandma Carol and Aunt Helen said they were giving medicine so Grandma wouldn't suffer. White pills. After taking them, Grandma would fall asleep right away. Controlling her anger, Margaret calmly continued asking, what happened today? Tears began to well in Amy's eyes. When I got back from school, Grandma was sleeping in bed. But something was wrong. I said, Grandma, are you okay? But she didn't answer. She took a deep breath and continued, Grandma Carol and Aunt Helen said, Grandma is just tired, but I thought something was strange. So? Amy showed a slightly embarrassed expression. I took one pill from Grandma's table. As evidence. Because. You're a smart girl, Margaret looked proudly at her daughter. And then. Grandma Carol and Aunt Helen came into the room and tried to give me the same medicine, saying it was a pill to make me feel better. I said, I don't want it, but. Amy's voice trembled. Aunt Helen held me down, and Grandma Carol forced me to take it. Anger nearly exploded inside Margaret, but she maintained her composure in front of her daughter. Thank you for telling me, Amy. You were very brave. Amy hesitantly asked, is Grandma okay? The question startled Margaret. She immediately called a nurse and inquired about Ruth's condition. A few minutes later, she received a report that Ruth had also been transported to the same hospital and was receiving treatment in the intensive care unit. Grandma is fine too, Margaret reassured Amy. She's getting good treatment. There was a knock at the door, and Officer Johnson entered. After winking at Margaret, he smiled kindly at Amy. Hello, Amy. How are you feeling? Amy nodded, looking a bit nervous. I'm okay. Could you tell me what happened? Officer Johnson asked in a gentle voice. Don't be afraid. We're trying to protect you and your grandmother from bad people. Amy looked at Margaret, and after seeing her nod, began to recount her experience again, this time in more detail, telling everything she had seen and heard at her grandmother's house. Men in suits came several times, Amy said. They were getting signatures on papers. When Grandma asked, what's this, they said, just hospital documents. Officer Johnson recorded everything and finally praised Amy for her courage. After he left, Dr. Linden came in and confirmed that Amy's condition was stable. She should be able to go home tomorrow morning, the doctor said. Get plenty of rest. Past midnight, after Amy had fallen asleep again, Margaret visited Ruth in the intensive care unit. The elderly woman looked frail, but she had regained consciousness and teared up upon seeing Margaret. I'm sorry, Ruth said in a weak voice. I was fooled by those girls. You have nothing to apologize for, Grandma, Margaret squeezed the elderly woman's hand. Everything will be okay, now. The next morning, as Margaret and Amy were completing the hospital discharge procedures, Officer Johnson appeared again. His expression was stern. The investigation results are in, the officer said quietly. Carol and Helen were misusing Ruth's assets. We found records of bank account misuse, forged real estate documents, and fraudulent use of multiple checks. Although shocked, Margaret had somehow sensed this. And what about them? They've been arrested, the officer answered. They'll likely be charged with fraud and assault on a minor. Additionally, when we searched the house with a warrant, we found notes practicing Ruth's signature, a large quantity of sleeping pills, and drafts of property transfer documents. Officer Johnson looked at Amy and smiled kindly. Amy, you were truly brave. Thanks to you keeping that pill as evidence, both you and your grandmother were saved. Amy smiled, looking a bit embarrassed. What should we do now? Margaret asked. A probation officer will be assigned until Ruth is discharged, the officer explained. After that, it's likely you'll be appointed as a temporary asset manager by the court. Margaret exhaled deeply. The long battle was just beginning, but at least the worst had been avoided. Holding Amy's small hand, she renewed her determination. "Thank you, Amy," she whispered to her daughter. "You're the real hero." As the seasons changed from winter to spring, small flowers began blooming in Margaret's garden. 3 months had passed since Ruth's discharge, and she had begun a new life living with Margaret and Amy. Carol and Helen's trial had ended just last month. Both were found guilty of fraud and harming a minor. Carol received a 5-year sentence, and Helen 3 years. Throughout the trial, Carol had insisted that everything was for Ruth's sake. That she had only transferred the savings to cover the elderly woman's medical expenses. But the evidence was overwhelming. Unauthorized withdrawals from bank accounts, practice sheets for forging signatures, and even notes detailing medication dosage adjustments were discovered. Meanwhile, Helen changed her attitude midway through the trial, tearfully admitting her guilt. "I couldn't escape Mother's influence," she testified. "But that's no excuse. I'm truly sorry for what I did to my sister, my niece, and grandmother." Margaret couldn't forgive her immediately. Even when they passed each other in the courthouse hallway, she avoided Helen's gaze. However, somewhere in her heart, she sometimes considered that perhaps her sister too had been a victim unable to escape their mother's control. In the living room, Amy was having Ruth check her math homework. The former lethargy gone, Ruth had returned to being the intellectual and lively elderly woman she once was. Thanks to proper treatment and rehabilitation, her health had recovered surprisingly well. "Mom, look. I solved all the problems using the method Grandma taught me." Amy proudly held up her homework book. Margaret smiled. "That's wonderful." Ruth placed her hand on her granddaughter's shoulder and proudly said, "Amy is really smart. She might become a doctor someday." This is what a real family should be like, Margaret thought. A relationship where people respect, encourage, and support each other. There was a sound of mail being delivered to the mailbox. When Margaret picked it up, she saw it was postmarked from the prison. It was from Helen. She hesitated but eventually decided to open it. "Margaret. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I have no right to ask for that. I just want you to know something. I've started psychological counseling in prison. And I'm also participating in educational programs. I'm studying nursing. Someday, after I'm released, I want to do work that helps people. Please give my regards to Amy and Ruth. And know that I sincerely wish happiness for all of you. Helen." Margaret stared at the letter for a while. She couldn't forgive immediately. But perhaps, time might heal. "Did something happen?" Ruth asked. "A letter from Helen," Margaret answered quietly. "She seems to be trying to rehabilitate herself." Ruth was silent for a moment, then said, "People can change. It takes time, but they can." Margaret nodded. Then she glanced at the new asset management plan documents she had drawn up with the lawyer. Now she was Ruth's legal asset manager, handling everything transparently. Not for money, but to protect someone dear to her. "Hey, everyone," Margaret suggested. "Shall we go for a picnic this weekend?" Amy jumped up with joy, and Ruth nodded happily. Outside the window, the spring sunlight shone as if blessing the beginning of their new life. Having overcome difficulties, they had become a family in the truest sense. It was a stronger bond formed not just by blood, but by caring for and protecting each other. As Margaret looked at Amy and Ruth, she made a silent vow she would continue to protect this precious family.